I came home late, the sound of the front door clicking shut echoing through our empty house. Emma's car was in the driveway, but the lights were off, save for the dim glow under the kitchen door. I dropped my keys on the table, my hand trembling, still buzzing from the unnerving conversation I had just had with one of our top clients. But it wasn't the work stress that was making me uneasy, it was the thought of what awaited me on the other side of that door. Our house had never felt so cold, so uninviting. Emma and I used to have this unspoken rhythm, two entrepreneurs who built a life together, both in business and in marriage. We were partners in everything. She ran the creative side of our company, and I handled the business end. It was perfect, or at least it had been, until recently. Lately, Emma had been different. I couldn't pinpoint the moment it started, but there was a change, a subtle but pervasive shift in her behavior that I couldn't ignore. She'd been more distant, preoccupied with something that she couldn't, or wouldn't, share with me. And then there was the nausea, the cravings for salty foods, the strange moments when she'd look at me as if she wanted to say something, only to stop herself. As I approached the kitchen, I heard the water running. Emma was at the sink, her back to me, oblivious to my arrival. The soft hum of the faucet and the clinking of dishes filled the room, but there was an undercurrent of tension, thick and palpable. I stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment, trying to read her body language. She was wearing one of my old t-shirts, her hair tied up in a messy bun, but there was nothing comforting about the sight. The air was charged, like the moments before a storm breaks. "Hey!" I called out, trying to sound casual. She jumped, nearly dropping a plate. "Oh my God, you scared me," she said, turning around with a forced smile. "You're home late." "Client dinner ran long," I replied, stepping into the kitchen. I moved closer, trying to catch her eye, but she was already back to scrubbing the dishes, avoiding my gaze. The conversation we should have had weeks ago sat heavy on my tongue, but I swallowed it down. "What's wrong, Em?" I finally asked, my voice low, careful. She froze, the sponge in her hand hovering over a glass. "What do you mean?" she asked, too quickly. Her voice was too light, too controlled, and it set off every alarm in my head. "You've been different," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Distant. And it's not just the stress at work, is it?" For a moment, she didn't respond. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken fears. When she finally turned to face me, there was a strange look in her eyes, something between guilt and sorrow. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by that same forced smile. "I'm fine, really," she said, her voice too bright. "Just tired. Work has been crazy, and I guess I haven't been myself lately. But it's nothing to worry about." But it was something to worry about. I could feel it in my bones. I wanted to press her, to demand she tell me what was really going on, but I didn't. Instead, I nodded, forcing a smile of my own. "Okay. Just let me know if you want to talk about anything." She nodded, turning back to the dishes. "I will," she said, but there was something final in her tone, like she had already made up her mind about something. The tension was suffocating, and I needed to get out of there. "I'm going to bed," I muttered, turning to leave. But as I walked away, something caught my eye, her purse, lying on the counter, half open. It was such a small thing, but in that moment, it felt like a neon sign screaming at me to look closer. Without thinking, I reached out and tipped it over, spilling the contents onto the counter. My heart pounded in my chest as I sifted through the usual clutter, lipstick, keys, her phone, until my fingers brushed against a blister pack of pills. I froze. There was only one pill left in the pack, and the label read prenatal vitamins. The room spun as I stared at the small, innocuous pills, my mind racing to catch up with what I was seeing. Prenatal vitamins? Emma wasn't pregnant. At least, not that I knew of. But then why the hell was she taking them? My thoughts spiraled into darker places, thoughts I didn't want to consider, but couldn't ignore. Was she cheating on me? The idea hit me like a freight train, knocking the breath from my lungs. Emma had been acting so strange, so distant, and now this. It all pointed to one thing, one horrifying possibility that I couldn't shake. But I couldn't confront her, not yet. I needed to know more, to be sure before I blew everything up. So, I did something crazy, something desperate. That night, after she fell asleep, I carefully opened the blister pack, removed the last pill, and replaced it with a harmless vitamin. I sealed it back up as best I could, my hands trembling the whole time. It was risky, insane even, but I had to know. The next morning, I watched her take the pill, my heart pounding in my chest. She didn't notice anything wrong. If she was pregnant, the switch would show soon enough. But I couldn't stop there. I needed to know more, to find out who she was talking to, what she was hiding. So, I made the decision to install hidden cameras in her office and our home. I was playing a dangerous game, but I couldn't stop now. I had to know the truth, even if it destroyed me. The hidden cameras were a stroke of genius, or madness, I wasn't sure which. But once they were in place, there was no turning back. It felt wrong, invasive, but the need to know the truth had overtaken any sense of morality I once had. Every night after Emma went to bed, I would retreat to my office, close the door, and watch the footage. At first, it was mundane, Emma working late, taking calls, occasionally going out for lunch. But soon, I started to notice the patterns. She had a routine, arrive at the office, settle into her desk, and then, like clockwork, she'd receive a call around 10 a.m. The calls were short, never more than a few minutes, but each time, her expression would change. She would smile, a genuine smile, not the forced one she gave me these days. I couldn't hear what was being said, but it was clear these calls were important to her. And they weren't work-related. I couldn't stand it. The thought that she might be talking to someone else, someone who could make her smile like that, made my blood boil. I needed to know who it was, but I had to be careful. If I confronted her too soon, she would shut down, and I would never get the answers I needed. I bided my time, waiting for the right moment. Meanwhile, I kept up the charade of being the oblivious husband, pretending everything was fine. Emma, for her part, seemed completely unaware of my suspicions. She continued to act strangely, sick in the mornings, craving odd foods, and always distracted. But she never mentioned the prenatal vitamins, never hinted that she was pregnant. It was driving me insane. Then, one evening, it happened. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, when Emma's phone buzzed on the counter. She was in the shower, so I glanced at the screen. It was a message from someone named Angelica. I had never heard of anyone by that name, and something about it felt off. The message was short, "I need to talk. Can we meet tomorrow?" Curiosity got the better of me. I picked up the phone, unlocked it, thank God for the face recognition, and quickly scrolled through the messages. There weren't many, just a few, but they were all recent and all from this Angelica. The conversation was vague, but there was something unsettling about it. They talked about meeting up, about needing to discuss something important, something that couldn't be said over the phone. And then there was a message that made my stomach drop. "I'm so scared, Angie. I don't know what to do. I haven't told him yet, but I'm already 3 weeks along." 3 weeks along. My heart raced as I stared at the screen. 3 weeks along. Pregnant. She was pregnant, and she hadn't told me. But she had told this Angelica. What the hell was going on? I quickly put the phone down as I heard the water turn off. My mind was spinning. 3 weeks. That would put the conception around the time she started acting strange, around the time she started distancing herself from me. The timing was too perfect, too coincidental. But who the hell was Angelica? And more importantly, who was the father? I tried to keep calm, but my thoughts were a jumbled mess. What if she was cheating on me? What if she had gotten pregnant by someone else? But who? There was no mention of another man in the messages, no clue as to who this other person might be. The next day, I decided to take matters into my own hands. Emma left for work as usual, but instead of going to my office, I followed her. I kept a safe distance, careful not to let her see me. She drove to work, parked in her usual spot, and went inside. I waited in my car, waiting for something, anything, that would give me a clue. It was nearly lunchtime when she emerged from the building. She wasn't alone. A man followed her out, tall, broad-shouldered, with a confident stride. He was wearing a suit, but there was something casual about the way he moved, as if he didn't belong in it. They didn't touch, but there was a familiarity between them, something in the way they walked side by side. They walked to a small cafe down the street, sat at a table outside. I parked the car and slipped into a coffee shop across the road, where I could watch them without being seen. The man was talking, animated, his hands moving as he spoke. Emma was listening intently, nodding, occasionally laughing. The easy rapport between them made my skin crawl. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I didn't need to. The way they looked at each other, the way Emma seemed so at ease with him, told me everything I needed to know. This was the man she was confiding in, the man who knew her secrets, the man who might be the father of her child. As I watched them, anger bubbled up inside me. I wanted to storm over there, to confront them both, to demand answers. But I held back. I needed to be smart about this. I needed to gather more information before I made my move. When they finally got up to leave, I followed the man, keeping a safe distance. He walked back to the office, but instead of going inside, he headed down a side street. I tailed him to a nearby apartment building, watching as he entered. I waited a few minutes, then went in after him. The building was old, the kind with creaky floors and narrow hallways. I found the door he had gone through and stood outside, listening. I could hear muffled voices, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. My mind raced with possibilities, with scenarios that all led to the same conclusion: Emma was cheating on me with this man, and she was pregnant with his child. I felt a surge of rage, a primal urge to kick down the door and confront them both. But I knew that wouldn't get me the answers I needed. I had to be patient, had to wait for the right moment. That night, I watched the footage from the cameras again, searching for any clue, any slip-up that would confirm my suspicions. And then, I found it. Emma was on the phone, pacing back and forth in her office. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but I could make out the words: "Angelica, I don't know what to do. I'm pregnant. Yes, I'm sure. 3 weeks. But I haven't told him yet. I'm scared, Angie. What if he finds out it's not his?" The words hit me like a sledgehammer. It wasn't my baby. My worst fears were confirmed. She was pregnant with someone else's child. My wife, the woman I had trusted more than anyone in the world, had betrayed me in the worst possible way. I felt a cold, hollow emptiness settle in my chest. I had spent weeks suspecting, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that I wasn't prepared for. I didn't know what to do, where to turn. The woman I loved, the woman I had built a life with, was carrying another man's child. But I wasn't going to let her get away with it. Not without a fight. As I sat in my office, replaying the conversation over and over, a plan began to form in my mind, a plan that would turn the tables on her, a plan to make her pay for what she had done. I wasn't going to confront her, not yet. I was going to make her think everything was fine, that I hadn't figured it out. And then, when she least expected it, I would strike. The next morning, I started following Brian. I spent the next few days meticulously planning my next move. The name Brian Faison had appeared on the employee list for Emma's office, marked as an assistant to the chief director. It didn't take long to connect the dots. Brian was the man I had followed to that apartment, the one Emma had been confiding in. Now, he was at the center of this mess, and I needed to understand who he was and what kind of hold he had over my wife. I started by digging into his background. Brian had joined our company a little over a year ago, around the time Emma started running the creative department. His resume was impressive, with credentials from top universities and a history of working at some of the most prestigious firms in the city. But there was something else, something more personal. He was charming, with a smile that disarmed people and an easy confidence that made him popular with both colleagues and clients. Emma wasn't immune to his charms, it seemed. My days became a blur of surveillance and deception. I installed more hidden cameras, this time in Brian's office and the hallway outside it. I hacked into the office email system, searching for any incriminating exchanges between him and Emma. The deeper I dug, the more I discovered, and the more my anger simmered just beneath the surface. Every evening, after Emma fell asleep, I would sit in my office, headphones on, watching and listening. It became an obsession. I felt like I was living in a nightmare, one that I couldn't wake up from. I watched as Emma and Brian interacted, the subtle touches, the shared glances that lingered just a little too long. They were careful, but not careful enough. In those quiet moments, when they thought no one was watching, their true feelings were on display. It wasn't just the cameras that revealed their secret. I had started to follow Brian after work, spending hours tailing him through the city. Most of the time, he went straight home after work, but on a few occasions, he would meet up with Emma at a hotel or a secluded cafe. They never stayed long, just enough time to exchange a few words, a few stolen kisses. It was enough to confirm what I had feared. The truth was laid bare before me. Emma was having an affair with Brian, and she was pregnant with his child. But knowing the truth wasn't enough. I needed to confront them, to make them pay for what they had done. But I couldn't rush it. I needed to be smart, to plan every detail so that when the time came, there would be no escape for either of them. One evening, after another torturous day of playing the loving husband while seething inside, I decided it was time to take the next step. I watched as Brian left the office, heading home as usual. But this time, I didn't just follow him, I followed him to the front door of his apartment. I parked down the street, waiting in the dark until I was sure he was alone. Then, I made my move. I approached his door, my heart pounding in my chest, the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I knocked, and when Brian opened the door, he barely had time to react before I shoved my way inside, slamming the door behind me. His eyes widened in shock as he realized who I was. What the hell are you doing here?" he stammered, trying to regain his composure. I didn't answer. Instead, I grabbed him by the collar, pushing him up against the wall. The anger that had been building up inside me for weeks finally exploded, and before I knew it, my fist connected with his face. He stumbled back, clutching his jaw, his eyes wide with fear. "You think you can fuck my wife and get away with it?" I hissed, my voice low and dangerous. "You think I wouldn't find out?" Brian tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He was terrified, and that gave me a twisted sense of satisfaction. I had the upper hand now. "Sit down," I ordered, pointing to the chair in the corner of the room. "We're going to have a little chat." He didn't argue, didn't try to fight back. He knew he was caught. As he sat down, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth, I could see the fear in his eyes. He was trembling, his hands shaking as he clutched the armrests. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, pacing back and forth in front of him. "You're going to call Emma, and you're going to tell her to come over. You're going to tell her that you need to talk about the future of your relationship, about this baby. And if you say one word, that tips her off, I'll make sure you regret it." Brian nodded frantically, his fear palpable. I handed him his phone, watching closely as he dialed Emma's number. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened to the conversation, my mind racing with what was about to unfold. "Emma," he said, his voice shaking. "Can you come over? We need to talk about the baby." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I thought she might suspect something. But then she agreed, her voice soft, almost relieved. She said she would be there in 20 minutes. As soon as he hung up, I grabbed the phone from his hand and shoved him back into the chair. "You're going to sit here and wait quietly until she arrives," I ordered. "And when she gets here, you're going to tell her everything." Brian looked up at me, his eyes pleading. "Please, don't hurt her," he whispered. She didn't mean for any of this to happen. His words only fueled my anger. You should have thought of that before you decided to sleep with another man's wife, I spat, turning away from him in disgust. The next 20 minutes felt like an eternity. I paced the room, my mind racing with all the things I wanted to say, all the ways I wanted to make them pay. Brian sat silently in the corner, his head bowed, waiting for the inevitable. When I finally heard the knock on the door, I felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it, the moment of truth. I motioned for Brian to open the door, standing back as he did so. As soon as Emma stepped inside, she froze, her eyes widening in shock when she saw me standing there. The color drained from her face, and she looked at Brian, then back at me, as if trying to make sense of the situation. What's going on? She asked, her voice trembling. I didn't give her a chance to say anything else. I stepped forward, grabbing her by the shoulders and shaking her hard. You tell me, Emma, I said, my voice low and dangerous. You tell me what the hell is going on. She started to cry, tears streaming down her face as she tried to pull away from me. Please, let me explain, she begged, her voice breaking. It's not what you think. Not what I think. I shouted, my grip tightening on her shoulders. You're pregnant with his child, and you've been lying to me for weeks. How could you do this to me? Emma sobbed, shaking her head frantically. It was a mistake, she cried. I never meant for it to happen. I love you, I swear, but I don't know how I got this far. I pushed her away, unable to look at her. My chest was heaving, my heart pounding in my ears. The betrayal was too much, the pain too deep. I turned to Brian, who was still sitting in the corner, watching the scene unfold with a look of horror on his face. You both make me sick, I spat. But don't worry. You're going to pay for what you've done. Before either of them could respond, I stormed out of the apartment, slamming the door behind me. As I walked down the street, my mind was already racing with my next move. The time for confrontation was over. Now, it was time to destroy them both. The drive home was a blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, but my mind was elsewhere, drowning in a sea of rage, betrayal, and cold, calculating plans. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the initial shock had given way to a deadly calm. I had exposed Emma and Brian's affair, but this was far from over. If they thought they could destroy everything I had built, everything we had built, without consequence, they were dead wrong. Inside the house, I moved on autopilot. I poured myself a drink, the alcohol burning its way down my throat, but it did nothing to dull the anger simmering just beneath the surface. My mind was already working through the logistics of what needed to happen next. Emma hadn't come home yet, no doubt she was still at Brian's, crying over the mess they had created. That was fine. It gave me time to plan. I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the blank notepad in front of me. This was no longer about the affair, it was about making sure that neither of them came out of this unscathed. Emma had betrayed me in the worst possible way, and Brian had helped her do it. They needed to understand the magnitude of their actions, and I would make sure they did, legally, financially, and emotionally. The first thing I needed to do was secure our company. Emma might have been the creative force behind our business, but the finances were all mine. If she thought she could take everything from me in a divorce, she was sorely mistaken. I'd spent years making sure our assets were carefully managed, with contingency plans in place for any possible scenario. What I hadn't anticipated was this level of betrayal, but I would adapt. I started by drafting a list of everything that needed to be done, contact the lawyer, freeze joint accounts, secure important documents, and gather evidence. I needed to make sure that when Emma inevitably tried to come after me in court, she would find herself outmaneuvered at every turn. She had the emotional edge, sure, but I had the facts, and I was prepared to use them. As I sat there, methodically listing out the steps, I heard the sound of the front door creak open. Emma had finally come home. I didn't move, didn't look up as she walked into the kitchen. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. She stood in the doorway, her eyes red and swollen from crying, her face pale. "We need to talk," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "Do we?" I replied, my tone icy. "Because I'm not sure there's anything left to say." She flinched at my words, her hands twisting together nervously. "Please, just hear me out," she begged. "I know I've hurt you, and I'm so sorry. I never wanted it to go this far." "Then why did you do it?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Why did you lie to me? Why did you let him touch you? You could have stopped this at any point, but you didn't." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she shook her head. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I was confused, and Brian was there, and I don't know. I've been feeling so lost lately, and I didn't know how to talk to you about it." "Lost?" I scoffed. "That's your excuse? You were lost, so you decided to fuck someone else?" She winced at my harsh words, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she looked down at the floor, her shoulders slumped in defeat. "I didn't know how to tell you how I was feeling," she admitted. "And then, before I knew it, I was pregnant, and everything just spiraled out of control." The word pregnant sent a fresh wave of anger crashing through me. "Pregnant," I repeated, the word like poison on my tongue. "With his child. Not mine. And you didn't think to tell me?" "I was going to tell you," she insisted, looking up at me with pleading eyes. I didn't know how. I didn't want to hurt you any more than I already had." "Well, congratulations," I said bitterly. "You've succeeded in making sure that this is the most painful thing I've ever gone through." Emma's tears flowed freely now, and she took a step closer to me. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," she cried. "But please, let's try to figure this out together. We've built so much together. Don't throw it all away because of one mistake." "One mistake?" I snarled. "Is that what this is to you? A mistake? You've destroyed everything, Emma. Our marriage, our business, our future. And you want me to just, what? Pretend it didn't happen?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "I know I've ruined everything, but I still love you. I want to make this right. Please, we can get through this." I stared at her, incredulous. How could she possibly believe that we could come back from this? That we could salvage anything from the wreckage she had created? But as I looked into her tear-streaked face, I realized that she wasn't thinking clearly. She was desperate, clinging to the hope that we could somehow rebuild what she had shattered. But it was too late. The damage was done, and there was no going back. "I'm done," I said coldly. "I'm done with you, with this marriage, with everything. Tomorrow, I'm contacting my lawyer, and we're going to settle this once and for all. And then, you can be with Brian and your bastard child. But don't expect me to be a part of it." Emma's face crumpled, and she collapsed into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please," she whispered between sobs. "Please don't do this." But my mind was made up. I couldn't live with her anymore, couldn't pretend that everything would be okay. The trust was gone, the love was tainted, and the future we had planned together was in ruins. There was no salvaging this, no fixing what she had broken. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her there, broken and weeping. I went to our bedroom and began packing her things into a suitcase. The process was mechanical, detached, just another task to be completed. I couldn't think about what I was doing, couldn't let myself feel anything. If I allowed the emotions to break through the surface, I wasn't sure I would be able to keep it together. As I packed, my mind raced with thoughts of the future. The divorce would be messy, but I would make sure I came out on top. I would strip her of everything she had, just as she had stripped me of my dignity and trust. She would be left with nothing but the life she had chosen with Brian. When the suitcase was full, I zipped it up and carried it downstairs. Emma was still in the kitchen, her sobs quieter now, more resigned. I placed the suitcase by the front door, then turned to her. "Your things are packed," I said flatly. You can stay here tonight, but I want you gone by tomorrow. We're done, Emma. She looked up at me, her eyes swollen and red. What happened to us? She asked, her voice trembling. We were so happy. How did it all fall apart? You happened, I replied coldly. You and your lies. I didn't wait for a response. I walked out of the kitchen, out of the house, and into the night. The air was cool, crisp, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of dismantling our life together, piece by piece. As I drove away from the house, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was controlled now, directed. I knew what I had to do, and I was ready to do it. But just as I began to think that maybe, just maybe, I could start to rebuild my life, the phone in my pocket buzzed. I glanced at the screen. It was a message from Brian. My hands clenched around the steering wheel as I read it. We need to talk. Meet me at the park. Midnight. My mind raced with possibilities. Why would Brian want to meet now? What could he possibly have to say? I considered ignoring the message, driving past the park, and leaving this whole mess behind me. But something in the back of my mind urged me to go. This wasn't over yet, and if Brian wanted to talk, I was going to hear what he had to say. I pulled into the park, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The place was deserted, the trees casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. I parked the car and got out, my senses on high alert. I walked toward the bench at the center of the park, where I could see a figure standing in the shadows. It was Brian. He was leaning against the bench, his face bruised and swollen from our earlier confrontation. But there was something different about him now, a determination in his eyes, a resolve that hadn't been there before. You came, he said quietly as I approached. What do you want, Brian? I demanded, my voice cold. He looked at me, his eyes dark and serious. I want to fix this, he said. I want to make things right. I laughed bitterly. And how do you plan on doing that? You've already destroyed everything. Not everything, he replied. There's still a chance to fix this. But you need to know the whole truth. My heart skipped a beat. What truth? Brian took a deep breath, his expression serious. Emma doesn't know everything. There's something I haven't told her, something I should have told you from the beginning. What are you talking about? I asked, my voice sharp with suspicion. He hesitated, then met my gaze, his eyes filled with regret. The baby, he said quietly. It might not be mine. It might be yours. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. For a moment, I couldn't speak, couldn't process what he was saying. What the hell are you talking about? I finally stammered. It's true, Brian said, his voice steady. Emma told me she wasn't sure. She said the timing was close, that it could be either of us. She didn't want to tell you because she was afraid of what you'd do. But I can't keep this secret anymore. You deserve to know. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The room spun, and I had to steady myself against the bench. You're lying, I whispered, my voice shaking. You're trying to manipulate me. I'm not lying, Brian insisted. I swear to you, I'm telling the truth. Emma wanted to keep it from you, but I couldn't live with that. You need to know, because this changes everything. I stared at him, my mind reeling. Could it be true? Could the baby really be mine? And if it was, what did that mean for everything I had planned? Brian watched me, his expression unreadable. I know you don't believe me, he said. But think about it. If there's even a chance that the baby is yours, don't you want to know? Don't you want to make things right? I didn't know what to think. Everything I had believed, everything I had planned, was suddenly thrown into chaos. If the baby was mine, then what? What would I do? How could I go through with my plans to destroy them both if there was a chance that I was the father? I turned away from Brian, my mind racing. I needed time to think, to process everything he had told me. But there was no time. I had to make a decision, and I had to make it now. I looked back at Brian, my expression hardening. "You're telling me that there's a chance that baby is mine?" I asked, my voice cold. He nodded. "Yes." "And you expect me to just take your word for it?" "No," he said quietly. "I don't. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove it." I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it, the moment of truth. Everything hinged on what I did next. I took a deep breath, my mind made up. "Fine," I said, my voice firm. "We'll do a paternity test. If that baby is mine, then I'll deal with it. But if it's yours, I'll make sure you pay for what you've done." Brian nodded, his expression solemn. "Agreed." As I turned to leave, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, there was a glimmer of hope, a chance that maybe, just maybe, everything wasn't lost. But there was still so much at stake, so much that could go wrong. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The days that followed were a blur of tension, uncertainty, and fear. Brian and I agreed to keep our interaction that night a secret from Emma until the paternity test results were in. It was a strange, uneasy alliance, built on the shaky foundation of necessity. The knowledge that the child could be mine altered everything, turning my anger into something more complicated, a mix of dread, hope, and confusion. I couldn't bring myself to speak to Emma, couldn't look her in the eye without wondering whether the life growing inside her was mine or the result of her betrayal. We moved through the house like strangers, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. Emma, for her part, seemed to sense that something had changed, but she didn't push. She moved carefully around me, her gaze filled with guilt and sadness, but also with something else, something I couldn't quite decipher. Finally, the day came. The results were in. Brian and I met at a clinic, far from our usual haunts, to avoid any chance of Emma finding out prematurely. The wait in the sterile, white-walled room was excruciating. Every second felt like an eternity, my mind racing with the possibilities. What would I do if the baby was mine? Could I forgive Emma? Could I raise a child knowing how they came to be? And what if the baby was Brian's? Could I walk away, knowing she would build a life with him? When the nurse finally handed me the envelope, my hands were shaking. Brian sat across from me, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the envelope as if it held the power to decide our fates. In a way, it did. "Do you want to open it?" he asked, his voice tense. I shook my head, unable to speak. I didn't trust myself to open it, didn't trust myself not to lash out if the news was what I feared. Instead, I handed the envelope to Brian. He hesitated for a moment, then took it, his fingers fumbling with the seal. The sound of the paper tearing seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. He pulled out the paper, his eyes scanning the words quickly. For a moment, his expression was unreadable. Then, slowly, he looked up at me, his face ashen. "It's yours," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart stopped. "What?" "The baby, it's yours," he repeated, his voice hollow. I stared at him, the words not fully sinking in. Mine. The baby was mine. A mix of emotions flooded through me, relief, disbelief, terror. I had been preparing myself for the worst, bracing for the moment when I would have to let go of everything, but now it was all different. Brian handed me the paper, and I took it with trembling hands. I read the words over and over, but they didn't feel real. The numbers, the percentages, all pointing to the same conclusion: I was the father. I felt a strange, almost surreal sense of calm wash over me. Everything had changed, yet nothing had. Emma had still betrayed me, had still lied, but now there was something more at stake: our child. Brian sat back in his chair, looking defeated. "What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice tinged with resignation. I didn't answer right away. I was still processing, still trying to figure out what this meant for us, for me and Emma, for the future. But one thing was clear, I couldn't let this end the way I had planned. Not now. I don't know, I admitted. But I have to talk to Emma. He nodded, understanding. Do what you have to do. But if you ever need anything. I cut him off. This doesn't change what you did, I said, my voice firm. You still betrayed me, and I'm not going to forget that. He looked down, guilt written all over his face. I know. I'm sorry. Sorry isn't enough, I replied coldly. But I'll deal with you later. I left the clinic, the paper still clutched in my hand, my mind racing with what I needed to do. For so long, I had been focused on revenge, on making Emma and Brian pay for what they had done. But now, with the knowledge that I was the father of this child, everything had shifted. I had to think about more than just my anger, I had to think about my child, our future. When I got home, Emma was sitting in the living room, staring out the window. She turned when she heard me come in, her eyes red from crying. Where have you been? She asked, her voice raw with emotion. I didn't answer. Instead, I walked over to her and handed her the envelope. She took it, confusion flashing across her face as she opened it. Her eyes scanned the paper, widening as she realized what it was. You did a paternity test? She whispered, looking up at me with a mixture of shock and betrayal. I had to know, I said quietly. I had to know if the baby was mine. She stared at me, her eyes filling with tears. And? What did it say? It's mine, I replied, my voice steady. For a moment, she just stood there, processing. Then, slowly, she sank back into the chair, the paper falling from her hands. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking as she began to cry. I'm sorry, she sobbed. I'm so sorry. I didn't know what to say. I had spent weeks imagining this moment, imagining all the things I would say to her, all the anger I would unleash. But now, faced with the reality of our situation, the words wouldn't come. Instead, I sat down across from her, watching as she cried. What do we do now? She finally asked, her voice small, broken. I don't know, I admitted. But we can't go on like this. We can't pretend that everything's okay when it's not. She nodded, wiping her eyes. I know. But I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose us. Emma, I said, my voice soft but firm, we've already lost each other. You made sure of that. She looked up at me, her eyes pleading. Please, can't we try to fix this? For the baby's sake? The mention of the baby sent a pang of guilt through me. I had been so focused on my own pain, my own betrayal, that I hadn't thought about the child growing inside her. My child. Could I really walk away, leave Emma to raise our baby alone? I don't know if I can do that, I said honestly. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. I'll do anything, she said desperately. Anything to make it right. Just, please, don't leave me. I looked at her, seeing the woman I had once loved, the woman I had built a life with. She was broken, shattered by the choices she had made, but there was still a part of me that cared for her, that wanted to believe we could find a way forward. But then, the doorbell rang. Emma and I both froze, the sound cutting through the heavy silence. She looked at me, confusion and fear in her eyes. Who could that be? I don't know, I said, getting up to answer it. I opened the door, and my heart nearly stopped when I saw who was standing there. It was Brian. What the hell are you doing here? I demanded, my voice rising with anger. Brian looked at me, his face pale, his eyes filled with desperation. I'm sorry, he said quickly. But I had to come. There's something you need to know. My patience was wearing thin. We've already said everything that needs to be said, I snapped. Now isn't the time. No, you don't understand, he insisted. This isn't about the baby. It's about Emma. There's something you don't know, something she hasn't told you. I felt a cold knot of dread form in my stomach. What are you talking about? I demanded. Brian hesitated, glancing past me into the house where Emma was standing, her face a mask of fear and guilt. She's been lying to you, he said quietly. About everything. What do you mean? I asked, my voice low and dangerous. She told you she didn't know who the father was, Brian said, his eyes locked on mine. But that was a lie. She knew all along. She knew the baby was yours. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. What? She knew, Brian repeated. She only told me she wasn't sure because she wanted to keep you both on the hook. She didn't want to lose either of us, so she played us against each other. I turned to Emma, my heart pounding in my chest. Is that true? I asked, my voice trembling with fury. Emma's face crumpled, and she collapsed onto the couch, sobbing. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. The betrayal hit me like a tidal wave, drowning me in anger, pain, and disbelief. This entire time, she had known the truth, and she had chosen to lie, to manipulate both of us. I had been prepared to try and move forward, to find a way to make things work for the sake of our child, but this was too much. I looked at her, feeling nothing but contempt. You lied to me, I said, my voice cold and hollow. You've been lying to me this whole time. Emma sobbed harder, her hands covering her face. I didn't know what to do, she cried. I was so scared, and I didn't want to lose you. But you did lose me, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You lost me the moment you decided to cheat. And now, you've lost everything. I turned to Brian, who was watching the scene with a look of regret and guilt. Get out, I said, my voice firm. You've done enough. Brian nodded, looking defeated. I'm sorry, he said again, before turning and walking away. I closed the door behind him, feeling a cold emptiness settle over me. The rage that had driven me for so long was gone, replaced by a numbness that left me hollow. I walked back into the living room, where Emma was still crying. But I didn't feel anything for her anymore. No anger, no pity, nothing. Whatever love I had left for her had been destroyed by the final betrayal. I want you out, I said quietly. I don't care where you go, but I don't want to see you anymore. I'll make arrangements for the baby, but as far as we're concerned, we're done. Emma looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear. Please, she begged. Please don't do this. We can still make this work. No, I said firmly. We can't. With that, I turned and walked away, leaving her behind. The house felt suffocating, filled with the ghosts of the life we had once shared. But now, it was just a reminder of everything I had lost. As I stepped outside into the cold night air, I took a deep breath, trying to clear my mind. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: I would rebuild, I would survive. But Emma would not be a part of it. I drove away, leaving everything behind: my marriage, my home, my past. The road ahead was long, but I would face it alone, stronger than before. And as for Emma and Brian, they could deal with the wreckage they had created. I was done with them both. 2 months had passed since that night. 2 months since I had left Emma sobbing on the living room floor, walked out of our house, and vowed never to look back. 2 months of silence between us, with only our lawyers communicating on our behalf. I had buried myself in work, drowning out the pain, the anger, and the sense of betrayal that had become a constant undercurrent in my life. The divorce proceedings had been brutal, but I had been prepared for it. I knew Emma would come after me, would try to take as much as she could, especially after Brian had left her. He had disappeared from her life just as quickly as he had entered it, and now, she was alone, pregnant, and desperately trying to salvage what she could. But I was ready. My lawyer was sharp, relentless, and had ensured that I came out of the proceedings with everything that mattered. The house was mine, The majority of the company was mine, and most importantly, I had secured full custody of our unborn child. Emma, stripped of her illusions and her dignity, was left with very little, just enough to start over, but not nearly enough to take away what was rightfully mine. Despite everything, I couldn't shake the lingering pain. Even though I had won in court, I didn't feel victorious. The child growing inside Emma was mine, but the thought of raising it alone, with the knowledge of how it had come to be, haunted me. I was torn between anger and a sense of duty, between the desire for revenge and the need to protect my child from the chaos Emma had created. Life moved on, as it always does, but the wounds remained fresh. I kept my distance from the people who had known us as a couple, unwilling to face their pity or judgment. I withdrew from social circles, avoiding the familiar places we had once frequented. My world became small, confined to work and the solitude of my empty house. It was during one of those lonely nights, when the silence was suffocating, that I found myself wandering the aisles of a supermarket. The mundane task of grocery shopping had become a refuge, a way to occupy my mind and avoid the thoughts that threatened to consume me. I moved through the store on autopilot, barely aware of my surroundings. And then I saw him. Brian. He was standing in the produce section, examining a bag of apples with a casual indifference that sent a surge of rage through me. He looked the same, confident, carefree, as if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't played a part in destroying my life. My fists clenched at my sides, and I could feel the blood rushing to my head. I wanted to confront him, to make him feel the pain he had caused, but I forced myself to stay calm. I couldn't afford to lose control, not here, not now. Brian glanced up and saw me. For a moment, his expression faltered, but then a smirk spread across his face. He dropped the bag of apples back onto the shelf and started walking toward me, that cocky swagger in his step that I had come to despise. Well, he drawled, stopping a few feet in front of me. If it isn't the miserable ex-husband. How's life treating you, buddy? I could feel my blood boiling, but I refused to let him see how much he was getting to me. What the hell do you want, Brian? I asked coldly. He shrugged, leaning casually against the shopping cart he had abandoned nearby. Nothing much. Just thought I'd check in, see how you're holding up. You look rough. I narrowed my eyes, refusing to rise to the bait. You've got a lot of nerve showing your face around here, I said, my voice low and dangerous. After everything you've done. Brian laughed, the sound grating on my nerves. Done? Oh, come on, don't act like you're so innocent in all of this. We both know you weren't exactly the perfect husband. I felt a flash of anger, but I forced it down. Whatever issues Emma and I had, they were ours to deal with, I said through gritted teeth. You had no right to get involved. He scoffed, rolling his eyes. Please. Emma was practically begging for someone to come along and save her from your boring life. She just happened to choose me. You were nothing but a mistake, I shot back, my voice hard. And she knows it. Brian's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. Mistake or not, I had her. And you? Well, you're just a sad, bitter man with nothing left but your pity party. The words cut deep, but I refused to let him see it. You're wrong, I said firmly. I have something you'll never have. My child. And nothing you say or do will change that. Brian's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something in his gaze, jealousy, perhaps, or regret. Enjoy it while it lasts, he sneered. Emma will be back. They always come back. I shook my head, pity mixing with my anger. You don't get it, do you? It's over. You were just a distraction, a way for her to escape the mess she created. But she's alone now, Brian. And you're nothing but a footnote in her life. Brian's face darkened, the bravado slipping away. We'll see about that, he muttered, before turning and walking away, his steps less confident than before. I watched him go, my heart pounding in my chest. The encounter had left me shaken, the anger and frustration that I had tried so hard to control now bubbling to the surface. I knew I should just let it go, move on with my life, but the thought of Brian's smug face, his casual dismissal of everything he had done, was like a splinter in my mind, festering and growing until I couldn't ignore it anymore. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the encounter. Brian's words replayed in my head, his taunts echoing in my mind. I tried to focus on work, on the preparations for the baby's arrival, but it was no use. The anger was back, stronger than before, and this time, I couldn't push it aside. I started drinking again. Just a few beers at first, to take the edge off, but soon, it wasn't enough. The alcohol numbed the pain, dulled the sharp edges of my thoughts, but it also fueled the anger, feeding the fire that burned inside me. And then, one night, after too many drinks, I made a decision that I would never be able to take back. It was 2 a.m. when I stumbled out of the house, the flask of vodka I had drained still clutched in my hand. My vision was blurry, my mind fogged with alcohol and rage, but there was a clarity in my purpose that I hadn't felt in months. I was going to end this, once and for all. I drove to Brian's house, the familiar route etched into my mind from all the times I had followed him. The streets were empty, the night silent, save for the hum of the engine and the pounding of my heart. When I arrived, I parked the car a block away and walked the rest of the distance. The cold night air bit into my skin, but I barely felt it. All I could think about was what I was going to do when I saw him. Brian's house was dark, the windows shuttered, the only light coming from the street lamp on the corner. I stood in front of the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the alcohol fueling the adrenaline that surged through my veins. I didn't knock. I didn't need to. I kicked the door open with a single, forceful blow, the sound of splintering wood echoing through the silent night. I heard movement inside, the sound of footsteps and a muffled curse. Then, the lights flicked on, and Brian appeared at the top of the stairs, his face pale and drawn with fear. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded, his voice shaky. I didn't answer. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the gun. The weight of it was solid, reassuring, in my hand. "Are you insane?" Brian shouted, backing away as I started up the stairs. "Put that down, man. We can talk about this." But I didn't want to talk. There was nothing left to say. I raised the gun, aiming it directly at him. He froze, his eyes wide with terror. "Please," he whispered, all the bravado gone from his voice. "Don't do this. I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry." But it was too late. The alcohol had dulled my senses, but the rage was still there, burning brightly, driving me forward. "You destroyed my life," I said, my voice eerily calm. "You took everything from me." "I know," Brian begged, tears streaming down his face. "I know, and I'm sorry. Please, just don't do this." I hesitated for a moment, the weight of the gun heavy in my hand. But then I thought of everything I had lost, everything that had been taken from me, and the anger flared up again, hotter and more consuming than before. "Goodbye, Brian," I said quietly. And then I pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the small hallway, the flash of light blinding.